Well, good afternoon. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. And what I've been asked to do today is to get us to think about the Tallahassee bus boycott in context with the current historical moment that we're actually living through right now, and that is the global Black Lives Matter movement. And so I've been asked to kind of think about how we would situate the Tallahassee bus boycott and kind of bring it to life and think about the lessons it has for our own time. And I think this is a really important question. In fact, as a movement historian, I consider this to be really the most important question we can grapple with now. Like 1956, we are grappling with a lot of problems, a lot of social problems. Inequalities in our schools, inequalities in our criminal justice system, in labor markets, in the racial wealth gap. There are many unresolved issues, or issues that African Americans and their allies were grappling with in 1956, which are still with us today. So let me break down the Tallahassee bus boycott a little bit and talk about how I think it is relevant to our own time. And when I think about the boycott, I think first and foremost of one of the rank and file organizers of that boycott, Mrs. Laura Dixie. And several of you, or many of you, probably remember that when Mrs. Dixie passed away a few years ago, the Reverend Dr. R.B. Holmes referred to her Mrs. Dixie, as the mother of the movement. And when we learn about who Laura Dixie was, I think there's a lot of important lessons for our own time. Laura Dixie was not a college graduate. She was not an upper middle class person. She wasn't incredibly highly educated, but she was the foundation of the civil rights movement in Tallahassee. She was a rank and file organizer of the bus boycott, and she would go to her neighbors, she would go to people who were thinking about riding the bus and explain to them why it was important to honor the boycott. And without her and her working class brothers and sisters, the boycott would never have been successful. And she continued to work with Reverend C.K. Steele for decades after the end of the boycott. And so some lessons in Mrs. Dixie's life is that you don't have to be incredibly affluent or highly educated to be a movement organizer or a movement activist. Another lesson, the movement is intergenerational. The Tallahassee bus boycott was successful insofar as young people, like I'm talking about middle school students, high school students, college students, older elders, grandparents, great-grandparents. That was what made that movement. It was intergenerational. And so when we think about the civil rights movement, we often think of young people. And that's really cool. That's very important because in many cases, it was middle school and high school students who were courageous and took risks in the movement. But the movement was also intergenerational, and that's why it succeeded, because it needed every single person in the Black community in Tallahassee, not just people at Florida A&M, not just people in the French Quarter, not just people in what's now the Gaither neighborhood. It took everyone working together to win that boycott. So how would we apply those lessons of the Tallahassee bus boycott to the Black Lives Matter movement today? A lot of historians believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is the largest, potentially the largest social movement in American history. At least 20 million people marched in the streets last spring and summer, and the movement now has become global. Now, the civil rights movement in the 1950s was global as well. There were important connections between what was happening in Tallahassee with the struggle against white supremacy and segregation, and what was happening in Pretoria or Johannesburg with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. People in Latin America, people in Africa, people in Europe took inspiration by what people in Tallahassee did for a full year in organizing the Tallahassee bus boycott. So both movements are global. So what are some of the takeaways? One is that, again, it's going to take an intergenerational movement for justice to change the problems we have in our society now, those unresolved issues. Remember that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who played such a crucial role in the Montgomery bus boycott, remember that Dr. King's final book was called Chaos or Community, Where do we go from here? Let me repeat the title. Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here? Published in 1968. Now, Dr. King didn't write a book titled, Thank God We've Overcome, right? He asked, where do we go from here? Because he knew in 1968 that the movement had not succeeded, that it had not fulfilled most of the goals that Dr. King and Reverend Steele and Lord Dixie had for the movement. And those goals included equality, social justice, the end of poverty, not just poverty reduction, but the abolition of poverty. So the three takeaways I'll leave us with this afternoon are, number one, do what you're doing right now. Continue to learn from our movement history. Talk to the elders who we still have with us who took part in the Tallahassee bus boycott. Learn how they had the courage, how they found the courage to stand up for their rights. Well, I'm a historian, so obviously I'm going to say that, right? But number two is fight injustice from where you are at, right? Okay, so if you're a school teacher, fight injustice where you work at, in the school system, in the educational system, right? If you work in other areas, then fight injustice where you are. Start from where you are at, where you feel comfortable. The final most important thing is find other people to organize with. This is Lord Dixie's central lesson for us today. Those of you who knew Mrs. Dixie knew that her house was a clearinghouse and a welcoming place and a meeting place for movement people. Her doors were always open. In fact, I never knew Mrs. Dixie's door, and Sam Dixie, her husband, I never knew their house to ever be locked, right? They were constantly having meetings, constantly having people over. There's a wonderful book called Democracy is an Endless Meeting, right? What that means is that the problems we face, brothers and sisters, today, in terms of the inequalities, the injustices, the continuing racism, the problems we face today are too big for one person or 5 people or even 100 people to overcome. We need organizing. We need backup. We need help. We need mutual aid, solidarity, support. Whenever we needed help in Tallahassee, whenever there was someone who was being mistreated, whenever there was a social injustice occurring, we knew we could call upon people like Mrs. Laura Dixie, Mrs. Patricia Stevens-Dew, Malachi Andrews, Charles Smith, the list goes on and on and on. The takeaway there is that, again, organizing involves a lot of people. You can't fight the system alone. You need to find people who will work with you. So I've already gone on probably a bit too long, but again, when you give a microphone to a history professor, that's kind of dangerous. But again, I'm very honored to be able to spend a few minutes with you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing in commemorating the Tallahassee bus boycott. This is a sacred day in the history of Tallahassee, in the state of Florida, and really in the United States of America. So thank you for what you're doing, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And ride the buses for free today.